March 22, 1622. Dawn breaks over Virginia. In dozens of settlements along the James River, English colonists wake to what seems like an ordinary day. Indigenous neighbors arrive bearing gifts: fish, deer, tools. They're smiling, familiar, trusted. By noon, 347 men, women, and children will be dead. This is the story of the massacre that nearly destroyed English America. For 8 years, Virginia knew something it had never known before: peace. It began in 1614 with a wedding. Pocahontas, daughter of Powhatan, the paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, married John Rolfe, the English tobacco planter. The marriage was political, a calculated alliance between two powers locked in a brutal, decade-long war, and it worked. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, which had killed hundreds on both sides since 1609, came to an end. Powhatan and the English agreed to a truce. Trade resumed. Prisoners were exchanged. The violence stopped. For the English, it was a godsend. Jamestown had nearly collapsed multiple times. Starvation, disease, warfare. Now, finally, they could expand, plant tobacco, build settlements, breathe. For Powhatan, it was strategic. The English were invaluable trading partners. They provided metal tools, weapons, and goods unavailable elsewhere. And perhaps, if managed carefully, they could be contained. Throughout the late 1610s, the two cultures intermingled. Powhatan people visited English settlements daily. They sold fish, game, and corn. They traded furs and pearls. Some worked as laborers or guides. English colonists, in turn, visited Powhatan villages. They learned the language, adopted indigenous farming techniques. Some even married into Powhatan families. It wasn't harmony. Distrust ran deep on both sides. But it was coexistence. By 1620, the colonists had grown comfortable, complacent even. Settlements sprawled along the James River, stretching miles from Jamestown. Plantations appeared on land that had been Powhatan hunting grounds for generations. The colonists stopped fortifying their homes. They worked unarmed in the fields. They let Powhatan men into their houses, shared meals, and allowed them to handle their tools. Why not? The war was over. Pocahontas had become a symbol of friendship between their peoples. Peace had held for years. But in Opechancanough, the Powhatan capital, the great chief watched the English multiply, and he grew old. Powhatan had ruled for decades, consolidating over 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes into a powerful confederacy. He'd fought the English to a stalemate, then negotiated a truce that preserved his people's autonomy. But by 1618, he was dying, and he saw what was coming. The English weren't guests anymore. They were colonizers. They cleared forests, fenced land, claimed ownership over territories that had belonged to the Powhatan for generations. Their tobacco plantations expanded relentlessly, exhausting soil and pushing deeper into indigenous territory. And their numbers kept growing. Every year, more ships arrived from England. More settlers, more demands. When Powhatan died in 1618, leadership passed to his younger brother, Opechancanough. He was older, perhaps in his 60s or 70s, but sharp, experienced, and deeply opposed to English expansion. He'd fought them before. He'd seen their treachery, their greed, their disregard for treaties. And unlike his brother, Opechancanough had no illusions about coexistence. He would smile, trade, pretend the peace held. But he was planning something else entirely. Opechancanough was a mystery to the English, and he preferred it that way. They didn't know his age, didn't know his whole history. Some colonists thought he was Powhatan's brother. Others believed he was adopted into the Confederacy from another nation. There were even wild rumors, never proven, that Spanish explorers had kidnapped him as a young man, taken him to Spain, converted him to Christianity, and then returned him to Virginia. What the English did know was that he was dangerous. He'd been a war leader during the conflicts of the 1610s. He'd ambushed English parties. He'd orchestrated the capture of Captain John Smith in 1607, the famous incident where Pocahontas allegedly intervened to save Smith's life. But Opechancanough was more than a warrior. He was a strategist. When he became paramount chief in 1618, he inherited a confederacy under immense pressure. English settlements now stretched from the mouth of the James River to the falls near present-day Richmond, over 50 miles of occupied territory. The colonists had claimed land for plantations that the Powhatan used for hunting and farming. English pigs roamed freely, destroying indigenous cornfields. Colonists cut down forests, disrupting ecosystems, and English diseases, smallpox, influenza, typhus, swept through Powhatan towns, killing hundreds. The population imbalance was shifting. In 1618, Virginia had roughly 400 English colonists. By 1622, there were over 1,200. They outnumbered the Powhatan in the immediate Jamestown region, and their tobacco economy demanded endless expansion. Opechancanough understood what the English either didn't see or didn't care about. This wasn't coexistence, it was displacement. The peace treaty of 1614 had been a pause, not a resolution. The fundamental conflict, indigenous sovereignty versus English colonization, remained unresolved, and the English kept pushing. They demanded more land. They executed Powhatan men accused of theft. They kidnapped children to educate them in English schools. They preached Christianity and dismissed Powhatan's religion as superstition. Opechancanough watched, waited, and planned. He couldn't simply declare war. The Powhatan Confederacy wasn't a unified military force. It was an alliance of semi-autonomous tribes. Some were weary of conflict. Others traded profitably with the English. Consensus was required, so Opechancanough built it, quietly. He consulted with tribal leaders. He reminded them of broken English promises. He pointed to the expanding plantations, the dwindling hunting grounds, the diseases, and the disrespect. And he proposed a solution. Not another skirmish, not another border raid, but total war. A coordinated surprise attack that would kill so many English that the survivors would flee back to England, abandoning Virginia forever. It was an enormous gamble. If it failed, English retaliation would be catastrophic. But if it succeeded, the Powhatan could reclaim their land, restore their autonomy, erase the English presence before it becomes irreversible. By 1621, Opechancanough had the support he needed. The plan was in motion. He just needed the right moment, the right provocation. In early 1622, the English gave it to him. His name was Nemattanough, but the English called him Jack of the Feather. He was a war captain, a priest, and one of Opechancanoug's most trusted advisors. The English described him as flamboyant. He wore feathers and swan wings in his hair, decorated his body with paint, and moved with a confidence that unnerved them. The Powhatan believed he was spiritually protected, immune to English bullets. He'd survived multiple battles. He encouraged warriors, led ceremonies, and embodied resistance to English encroachment. In March 1622, Nemattanough traveled to the plantation of a trader named Morgan. What happened next is murky. Colonial records are one-sided, self-justifying, and likely incomplete. The English claimed Nemattanough killed Morgan, perhaps in a trade dispute. Powhatan oral tradition suggests Morgan attacked first, or that the English fabricated the accusation. Whatever the truth, two of Morgan's servants confronted Nemattanough. A fight ensued. The servants shot him multiple times. Wounded, Nemattanough allegedly asked them not to tell his people he'd been killed by bullets, fearing it would shatter the belief in his invulnerability. He died shortly after. When the servants reported the killing to the authorities, they were arrested briefly, then released. The English considered the matter closed. To Opechancanough, it was a declaration. Nemattanu wasn't just a warrior. He was sacred. His death demanded justice, but the English offered none. No trial, no punishment, just the casual, dismissive violence that had characterized their treatment of the Powhatan for years. This was the provocation Opechancanough had been waiting for. He called a council of tribal leaders. The message was clear. The English would never respect Powhatan's sovereignty. They would never honor treaties. They would never stop expanding. And they would kill Powhatan leaders with impunity. The only solution was elimination. The attack would happen on March 22, 1622, a date chosen for logistical reasons. Spring planting had begun. Colonists would be scattered across fields and plantations, vulnerable. The weather was warming. Warriors could move quickly. And the English, lulled by years of peace, suspected nothing. Opechancanoug's instructions were precise. Warriors would arrive at English settlements unarmed, as they had for years. They'd offer food, help with work, and share meals. They'd be welcomed, trusted. And then, simultaneously across the colony, they would strike. Not with bows or clubs, but with the colonists' own tools. Axes, hoes, hatchets, knives. The weapons would be everywhere, leaning against fences, hanging in workshops, sitting on tables. The English wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The goal was total. Kill everyone. Men, women, children. Burn the houses. Destroy the crops. Leave nothing. If the attack succeeded, Virginia's English population would be devastated. The survivors would flee. The Powhatan would reclaim their land. It was a desperate, brutal plan. But Opechancanough believed it was the only way to save his people. On the night of March 21, 1622, warriors moved into position across Virginia. In dozens of settlements, English colonists slept peacefully, unaware that dawn would bring slaughter. Coordinating an attack across 50 miles of river settlements, involving hundreds of warriors from multiple tribes without the English discovering it, required extraordinary discipline. Opechancanough achieved it. For weeks, possibly months, warriors maintained absolute secrecy. They continued visiting English settlements, trading, smiling and acting as though nothing had changed. Some even slept in colonists' homes the night before the attack. The plan exploited the English colonists' greatest vulnerability, their trust. By 1622, the two cultures had coexisted peacefully for 8 years. Many colonists had daily contact with the Powhatan people. They'd shared meals, worked together, traded goods. Some colonists spoke Algonquian. Some Powhatan spoke English. This familiarity had bred complacency. Colonists no longer fortified their homes. They worked alone in distant fields. They allowed Powhatan men to enter their houses freely. Opechancanough turned that openness into a weapon. Warriors would arrive at dawn on March 22nd, just as they had countless times before. They'd carry fish, game, or corn to trade. They'd be friendly, helpful. English families would welcome them, offer breakfast, ask for assistance with chores. The warriors would accept. They'd sit at tables. They'd pick up tools, axes for chopping wood, hoes for fieldwork, knives for butchering. And at a signal, perhaps a shout, maybe a predetermined time, they would turn those tools on their hosts. The attack would be simultaneous, not sequential, not gradual. Every settlement, at the exact moment, would erupt in violence. This simultaneity was critical. If one settlement was attacked first, and the survivors fled to warn others, the English could fortify, arm themselves. The element of surprise would be lost. But if every plantation were hit at once, there would be no warning, no escape, no defense. The settlements targeted included Martin's Hundred, Berkeley Hundred, Henricus, Charles City, Falling Creek, Sheffield's Plantation, and dozens of smaller farms and estates. Some were home to just a few families. Others housed 20 or 30 colonists. All were vulnerable. Opechancanoug's strategy also accounted for the English military advantage. Firearms. Muskets were slow to reload, inaccurate, and useless in close quarters. By attacking at intimate range, inside homes, in kitchens, at breakfast tables, the warriors neutralized that advantage, and, by using the colonists' own tools, they ensured weapons would be readily available. Every farmhouse had axes. Every workshop had hammers. Every table had knives. The English had, unknowingly, armed their attackers. There was one major exception to the plan: Jamestown. The capital was too well defended, too populated, too alert. A direct assault would fail. So Opechancanough left it off the target list. His calculation was pragmatic. If the outlying settlements were destroyed, Jamestown would be isolated, starving, and demoralized. The survivors would have no choice but to abandon Virginia. The plan was brilliant, ruthless, and it depended entirely on secrecy. For weeks, hundreds of warriors kept the secret. But on the night of March 21st, 1622, one man broke, and that breach would save Jamestown, but doom everyone else. His name was Chanco. He was a Powhatan man, likely young, who'd been living among the English colonists, possibly as a servant, possibly as a convert to Christianity. The historical record is sparse. We don't know his age, his tribe, or his full motivations, but we know what he did. On the night of March 21st, 1622, Chanco's brother told him about the attack planned for the next morning. Perhaps he was trying to warn Chanco to stay away from English settlements. Maybe he assumed Chanco would join the attack. Instead, Chanco went to his master, a colonist named Richard Pace, whose plantation was across the river from Jamestown. Chanco told him everything: the plan, the timing, the targets. Pace was horrified. He armed himself, woke his household, and, in the middle of the night, rode across the James River to Jamestown. It was a dangerous journey in the darkness, but he had no choice. He reached Jamestown before dawn and alerted Governor Sir Francis Wyatt. Wyatt acted immediately. He ordered the town fortified, weapons distributed, lookouts posted. Nearby planters were warned and brought inside the palisade. When Powhatan warriors arrived at Jamestown on the morning of March 22nd, they found the gates closed and armed men on the walls. The attack on Jamestown was aborted before it began. But Pace and Wyatt couldn't warn the outlying settlements. There was no time, no way to communicate quickly across 50 miles of river territory. Riders were sent, but they wouldn't arrive for hours. By then, it was too late. So while Jamestown prepared, the rest of Virginia remained unaware. At Martin's Hundred, a thriving settlement of tobacco planters about 7 miles from Jamestown, colonists woke to a typical March morning. Men headed to the fields. Women prepared breakfast. Children played. Powhatan men arrived, as they often did, offering fish and venison. They were welcomed. At Berkeley Hundred, 15 miles upriver, the same scene unfolded. The warriors appeared at dawn, smiling. At Henricus, a settlement dedicated to educating indigenous children in Christianity, Powhatan visitors were invited inside. At plantations along the Appomattox River, at Sheffield's, at Falling Creek, the largest ironworks in English America, the morning seemed ordinary. By 8 a.m., the killing had begun. At Martin's Hundred, warriors grabbed axes and hatchets. They turned on their hosts with sudden, explosive violence. Families were slaughtered in their kitchens. Workers in the fields were cut down. A few colonists fought back. There are accounts of desperate hand-to-hand struggles, but most were overwhelmed. Within an hour, 58 people at Martin's Hundred were dead. The same horror unfolded simultaneously across the colony simultaneously. At Berkeley 100, 11 were killed. At Charles City, 6. At Falling Creek, 27, including the ironmaster, his family, and his workers. The ironworks, the pride of Virginia's industrial ambitions, were burned to the ground. By noon, the massacre was over. English colonists lay dead. 1/3 of Virginia's population gone in 4 hours, and the survivors faced a new nightmare. What came next? The violence was intimate, personal, horrifying. This wasn't a battlefield. There were no battle lines, no soldiers, no military formations. This was slaughter in kitchens, bedrooms, and gardens. At Woolston hometown, part of Martin's 100, archaeological. Excavations in the 1970s uncovered the remains of the attack. Skeletons bore evidence of brutal trauma. Skulls fractured by axes, bones shattered by blunt instruments, bodies hastily buried in shallow graves. One skeleton, a young man, had a Powhatan arrowhead lodged in his leg, evidence that some warriors did use traditional weapons alongside English tools. The written accounts, recorded by survivors and compiled by colonial officials, are harrowing. Edward Hill, a colonist who survived the attack at Charles City, described warriors entering homes with deer and other provisions to sell, then suddenly slew most barbarously everyone they could reach. At the plantation of Nathaniel Powell, a respected colonist who'd lived in Virginia since 1607, warriors killed him, his wife, and his children. Powell had considered the Powhatan his friends. He'd traded with them for years. He died in his own home, betrayed by people he trusted. At the college lands near Henricus, where the English had been building a school to educate indigenous children in Christianity, 17 people were killed, including George Thorpe, a profoundly religious man who'd advocated tirelessly for the kind treatment of the Powhatan. Thorpe had built Opechancanough, a European-style house, as a gesture of friendship. He was killed anyway. Women were not spared. Children were not spared. One account describes a woman fleeing with her infant. Pursued by warriors, she was caught and killed. The baby was thrown into a river. At some plantations, colonists managed to fight back. Guns were grabbed, swords drawn. A few warriors were killed, but the attackers had overwhelming advantages: surprise, numbers, and the colonists' own tools. At Falling Creek, the ironworks settlement, the attack was total. 27 people were killed. The forge was destroyed. Equipment smashed. Years of labor and investment were obliterated. By mid-morning, the outlying settlements were graveyards. Houses burned. Bodies lay in fields, on doorsteps, slumped over tables. Livestock wandered loose. Crops were trampled. The few survivors, those who hid, fled, or fought their way out, staggered toward Jamestown, traumatized and terrified. Some made it. Others died on the journey, bleeding, exhausted, hunted. By early afternoon, the killing had stopped. The warriors withdrew, melting back into the forests. They'd achieved their objective: devastation, but not total victory. Jamestown stood, and its 400 residents, armed and fortified, had survived. That single failure, the result of Chanco's warning, changed everything. If Jamestown had fallen, the colony would have collapsed. Ships arriving from England would have found ruins and corpses. The Virginia Company would have dissolved. English colonization of the Chesapeake would have ended. But Jamestown survived. And that meant the survivors could regroup, mourn, bury their dead, and plan their revenge. Because the English response to the massacre wouldn't be retreat. It would be extermination. When the first refugees staggered into Jamestown on the afternoon of March 22nd, the stories they told were almost incomprehensible. Entire families were wiped out. Settlements burned. Neighbors killed by people they'd shared meals with just hours before. Governor Francis Wyatt ordered an immediate head count. Riders were sent to settlements that hadn't yet reported. The gruesome tally began: Martin's 100, 58 dead. Berkeley 100, 11 dead. Henricus, 17 dead. Falling Creek, 27 dead. Charles City, 6 dead. Dozens more at smaller plantations scattered across the colony. The final count, 347 dead. Nearly 1/3 of Virginia's English population, entire communities had been erased. Plantations that had taken years to build were abandoned. Fields went unplanted. Livestock roamed wild. Jamestown itself was overwhelmed. Hundreds of terrified survivors crowded into the fort. Food supplies, already limited, were stretched dangerously thin. Medicine was scarce. Shelter was inadequate. And the psychological trauma was devastating. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers, artisans, families. They'd come to Virginia seeking opportunity, and now they'd watched their loved ones murdered. Trust was shattered. Every Powhatan person was now viewed as a potential threat. Even those who'd lived peacefully among the English for years, including Christian converts, were expelled or imprisoned. Chanco, the man whose warning had saved Jamestown, was praised by colonial officials. The assembly later granted him his freedom and a pension. But he disappeared from the historical record shortly after, his fate unknown. Meanwhile, Wyatt faced an impossible situation. The colony was on the brink of collapse. Again, starvation loomed. The planting season was already underway, but most fields were abandoned or unsafe. Colonists were too terrified to venture beyond Jamestown's walls. If crops weren't planted, there would be no harvest, no food, no tobacco to trade. Virginia would starve. Wyatt sent desperate letters to England, begging for supplies, soldiers, and reinforcements. But ships took months to cross the Atlantic. Help, if it came at all, wouldn't arrive until summer or fall. In the meantime, the survivors huddled in Jamestown, traumatized and furious, and that fury found a target. Colonial leaders, particularly Wyatt and the Virginia Company Council, began framing the massacre not as a military engagement or a response to English aggression, but as an act of barbarism, a betrayal, proof of indigenous savagery. They conveniently ignored the years of English encroachment, broken promises, and violence that had preceded the attack. They ignored the execution of Namatanoo. They ignored the theft of Powhatan's land. Instead, they crafted a narrative. The innocent English, extending the hand of friendship, had been treacherously attacked by ungrateful, bloodthirsty savages. This narrative served a purpose. It justified what came next, because the Virginia Company, in consultation with English authorities, made a decision that would define the next decade. Virginia would wage total war. Not for territory, not for defense, for extermination. The official policy, articulated in letters and company directives, was clear. The Powhatan must be destroyed. Their villages burned. Their crops were obliterated. Their people were driven out or killed. "We shall enjoy their cultivated places," one company official wrote, possessing the fruits of others' labors. The massacre had ended. The genocide was beginning. Life in Jamestown after March 22nd was a study in trauma and survival. The fort, designed to house a few hundred, now sheltered nearly 1,000. Families crammed into makeshift shelters. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, influenza. The death toll from disease in the months after the massacre rivaled the massacre itself. Food was critically short. The colony had relied on trade with the Powhatan for corn and game. That trade was now impossible, and the spring planting, critical for survival, had been disrupted. Colonists were terrified to leave Jamestown's walls. Fields sat empty. Livestock were slaughtered for immediate food, leaving no breeding stock for future herds. Governor Wyatt tried to impose order. He organized armed work parties to plant emergency crops near Jamestown. He rationed food. He sent requests for aid to neighboring colonies, Plymouth and the Caribbean, for help. But morale was shattered. Many colonists wanted to abandon Virginia entirely. They'd come seeking prosperity. They'd found only death. Letters sent back to England described Virginia as a slaughterhouse, a cursed land where English dreams went to die. The Virginia Company, already financially troubled, faced collapse. Investors were furious. The massacre dominated London's news. Pamphlets described the horrors in lurid detail, blaming company mismanagement for leaving settlers defenseless. King James I launched an investigation. By 1624, the company's charter would be revoked, and Virginia would become a royal colony under direct crown control. But in the summer of 1622, the colonists weren't thinking about politics. They were thinking about survival and revenge. In May, supplies finally arrived from England: food, weapons, ammunition. And with them came new orders: fight back. The Virginia Company's instructions were explicit. The colonists were authorized to invade the Powhatan by all means possible, to destroy their villages, burn their crops, and kill or drive out the inhabitants. There would be no more peace negotiations, no more treaties, no more pretense of coexistence. The English would take what they wanted, and they would destroy anyone who resisted. Governor Wyatt organized the first retaliatory raids in June 1622. Armed parties, 50 to 100 men, moved upriver, attacking Powhatan villages. They burned homes, torched cornfields, killed anyone they encountered. Warriors, elders, women, children, the Powhatan fought back. But the dynamics had shifted. The English were no longer scattered and vulnerable. They moved in disciplined, armed units. They had superior firepower, and they had no mercy. One ruthless tactic emerged. The English would offer peace, invite Powhatan leaders to negotiate, then poison them. In May 1623, at a supposed peace conference, English colonists offered a toast with poisoned wine. Approximately 200 Powhatan people drank it. Many died immediately. Others were killed in the ensuing chaos. It was treachery mirroring the March 22nd massacre, an intimate betrayal, a weaponization of trust. The message was clear. There would be no rules, no honor, no limits. This was a war of extermination, and it would rage on and off for more than 20 years. The Second Anglo-Powhatan War didn't have clear battles or decisive victories. It was a grinding, brutal conflict of attrition. Every summer, English raiding parties swept through Powhatan territory, burning crops just before harvest. The goal was starvation. If the Powhatan couldn't grow food, they'd be forced to flee or submit. It worked. By the mid-1620s, Powhatan villages along the James River were abandoned. Tribes retreated north and west, away from English-controlled territory. The Confederacy, which had once dominated the Chesapeake region, was fracturing under the relentless pressure, and the English seized the land. Colonial officials openly admitted the strategy. Edward Waterhouse, writing an account of the massacre for the Virginia Company in 1622, stated it plainly: "We, who hitherto have had possession of no more ground than their waste, may now by right of war and law of nations invade the country and destroy them who sought to destroy us. Now their cleared grounds in all their villages, which are situate in the most fruitful places of the land, shall be inhabited by us." In other words, the massacre gave the English legal and moral justification to take everything. The Powhatan had cleared the land, planted the fields, and cultivated the soil. Now the English would simply take it, claiming it was the spoils of a just war. Tobacco plantations expanded rapidly. Land that had been off-limits under the 1614 peace treaty was now seized and parceled out to settlers. The Virginia Company encouraged immigration, offering land grants to anyone willing to come. Betrayal, the 1625, despite the massacre and the ongoing war, Virginia's English population had rebounded to over 1,200, the same level as before the attack. The Powhatan population, meanwhile, was collapsing. Warfare, starvation, and disease, especially smallpox, decimated their numbers. Entire villages disappeared. Tribes that had once been part of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy fragmented or fled the region entirely. Opechancanoug's gamble had failed. The massacre hadn't driven the English out. It had unleashed a genocidal response that destroyed his people faster than English expansion ever had. But Opechancanough didn't surrender. He continued fighting, leading raids, refusing treaties. The war dragged on until 1632, when both sides, exhausted, agreed to another truce. It lasted 12 years. In 1644, Opechancanough, now in his 90s, reportedly so old he had to be carried on a litter, launched one final attack. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to push the English back. On April 18, 1644, Powhatan warriors attacked English settlements again, killing nearly 400 colonists, even more than in 1622, but this time the English barely flinched. Their population had grown to over 8,000. Losing 400 was tragic, but not catastrophic. The retaliation was swift and brutal. English forces captured Opechancanough in 1646. He was brought to Jamestown as a prisoner. An English soldier, ignoring orders to keep him alive, shot him in the back. Opechancanough died in captivity, the last great resistance leader of the Powhatan Confederacy. With his death, organized indigenous resistance in the Virginia Tidewater ended. The English had won, not through honor or negotiation or coexistence. Through relentless, systematic violence, the Massacre of 1622 transformed Virginia and the future of English colonization in America. It ended any possibility of coexistence. Before March 26th, there had been trade, intermarriage, and cautious cooperation. After that, there was only conquest. The English adopted a policy that would echo across 3 centuries of American expansion. Indigenous people were obstacles to be removed, not neighbors to be accommodated. The language used to justify this policy, savage, treacherous, barbaric, became embedded in colonial culture. The massacre was retold in sermons, pamphlets, and histories as proof of indigenous inferiority and English righteousness. The victims, 347 men, women, and children, were transformed into martyrs. Their deaths became propaganda, used to justify wars of extermination from Virginia to California. And the Powhatan perspective was erased. English accounts described the attack as unprovoked, ignoring decades of land theft, broken treaties, and violence. They portrayed Opechancanough as a villain, rather than a leader defending his people's survival. The massacre also had immediate political consequences. It bankrupted the Virginia Company. King James I, appalled by the death toll and the company's mismanagement, revoked its charter in 1624. Virginia became a royal colony, governed directly by the crown. Ironically, this transition strengthened the House of Burgesses. As a royal colony, Virginia's assembly became a permanent fixture, ensuring local representation even as the monarchy asserted control. So, the massacre indirectly reinforced the democratic institutions that would, 150 years later, fuel the American Revolution. But it also accelerated another institution, slavery. The constant warfare with indigenous nations made reliance on indigenous labor impossible. English indentured servants were expensive and temporary. Increasingly, planters turned to enslaved Africans as a permanent, controllable labor force. By the 1640s, slavery was becoming entrenched in Virginia law. The massacre had created a labor crisis that slavery filled. So 2 legacies emerged from March 22, 1622. The two, expansion of representative government and the expansion of racial, slavery, liberty for some, built on the subjugation of others. For the Powhatan, the consequences were catastrophic. By 1670, the once powerful Confederacy was reduced to a few hundred people living on tiny reservations. Their land, hundreds of thousands of acres, was gone. Their political power was erased. Their population decimated. Some tribes fled west. Others were absorbed into English society as laborers or servants. A few communities survived, clinging to their identity despite relentless pressure to assimilate. Today, descendants of the Powhatan Confederacy still live in Virginia. The Pamunkey, Mattapony, and other tribes have preserved their languages, traditions, and histories despite centuries of colonization. They remember 1622 differently from the English did. Not as a day of treachery, but as a desperate act of resistance. A final attempt to protect their homeland from an invader that would not stop. Both memories are true. Both are incomplete. The massacre was a tragedy. For the 347 colonists who died, for the Powhatan who were destroyed in the aftermath, for the cycles of violence it set in motion. It was also a turning point. The day coexistence died and conquest became inevitable. The blood spilled on March 22, 1622, soaked into the soil of Virginia, and America grew from it.